SIFU is a single-player action beat-em-up video game developed and published by Slowclap. The game was released on February 8, 2022 for PC, PlayStation 4, and PlayStation 5. As of the time of making this video, the PC version of this game is only available via the Epic Game Store. This overview will cover the gameplay, the game world, the story, as well as other features. Let's start off with the gameplay. I believe the first thing that needs to be addressed about this game is its unique gameplay mechanic involving player deaths. Whenever you start a new game or replay the game's first stage, your character begins at the age of 20 years old with a death counter at 0. Each time your character dies, you add 1 to your death counter, and from there you may choose to rise up and be resurrected at the cost of growing older. Your death counter will determine how much you age every time you are resurrected. In the event that you reach the age of 70 and above, this will be the last chance you'll have, and it will lead to a game over if you die once more. Your age and death counter will carry over all the way to the end of the game, and while there is no way to reduce your age, you may be able to reduce your death counter down to 0, but more on this later. When it comes to combat, the game is played from a third-person perspective. The protagonist you play as is an unnamed martial artist that is highly skilled in the ways of Kung Fu. Your character is able to chain attacks together into various combos, with each string of moves having different effects against your enemies, such as being able to stun them or knock them down to the ground. But besides hand-to-hand combat, you may also pick up various melee weapons to deal more damage against enemies, and use your environment to your advantage by beating them up against a wall or even throwing them off a ledge. There are also several objects in the environment that you can pick up and throw towards your enemies, which will give you an opening to take them down. But SIFU is not just a button mashing game, and if you're not careful, you can easily be overwhelmed and defeated. This is where defensive moves such as guard, parry, avoid, and dodge come in handy. To guard is to block any kind of attack, and parrying is blocking an attack at the right moment, which then enables you to launch a counterattack. It is worth noting that there are certain enemy attacks that cannot be parried. However, most if not all attacks can be avoided and dodged. Avoiding is essentially your way to evade all kinds of attacks while still maintaining your position, whereas dodging is more of a quick step to move away from your enemies, or inversely, you may also use it to close the gap. You must time your avoiding perfectly depending on an attack in order to successfully evade them. There are 2 kinds of attacks you can avoid: high attacks and low attacks. Using the wrong avoiding move or mistiming them may result in you being damaged or even knocked down. With regards to defensive maneuvers, enemies, bosses, as well as your own character will have this gauge called the structure. It is essentially like a stamina bar that tells you whether you can still successfully guard an attack. If your structure gauge reaches its maximum threshold, your guard is broken and you will not be able to block any attack, which leaves you vulnerable to damage. You can gradually recover your structure if you are not actively guarding or performing any other move besides walking or standing. You may also replenish your structure through successful avoiding and parrying. When it comes to your enemy's structure, once you break them, you will be able to perform a finishing move called takedowns, which will initiate a sequence of attacks that will permanently incapacitate them. This is a way to quickly dispatch your enemies when the situation arises. However, there is a caveat when using takedowns. Occasionally, your enemies may be able to counteract the takedown, which will not only result to a full health recovery, but they will be enveloped with an aura that indicates that they are a much tougher enemy now, which basically transforms them into a mini-boss. But takedowns are not your only special move, as your character also has an ability called Focus, which enables you to slow time. But more importantly, it allows you to perform a special attack that will hit 100% of the time. Your focus meter replenishes when you fight and defend successfully. As you progress through the game, you may be able to unlock more focus attacks, which brings us to player progression. There are 2 primary ways to improve your character: a skill tree and shrine bonuses. The skill tree can be accessed through reaching several shrines in each stage. However, you can also access it whenever you die and also when you're at your home base. The skill tree allows your character to learn new combos and abilities, and as I've mentioned, you may also acquire new focus abilities. On the other hand, bonuses can only be accessed through shrines. Shrine bonuses allow you to increase your stats, such as your overall structure and health gained when you take down enemies. Furthermore, player progression is tied to 3 main components: your age, the score you accumulate while fighting, and experience points you earn through defeating enemies. Your age determines which skills and bonuses are available, as an older age means fewer options. However, if you manage to unlock these skills and bonuses before you reach a certain age limit, then you will be able to keep them. Your score determines whether you can afford certain bonuses, while experience points are used to unlock both skills and other bonuses. You can only select one bonus per shrine, but when it comes to skills, you may spend as much experience points as you have. It is worth emphasizing that a game over resets your skills and bonuses, but there are ways around this. When it comes to skills, you may spend more experience points to permanently unlock a skill. Permanently unlocking a skill ensures you will have that skill no matter how many times you reach a game over. Bonuses, on the other hand, are based on your current playthrough. So as an example, if you finish the first stage, you will carry over all bonuses you've selected in that stage towards the next stages. However, if you decide to replay the first stage again after playing the succeeding stages, your bonuses will reset as well as skills you haven't permanently unlocked yet. But besides skills and bonuses, your character's age also plays a factor in how strong you are. With each decade, there is a trade-off. Your damage output increases at the cost of your maxed health being lowered. And as I've mentioned earlier, there is no way to reduce your age, but you may reduce your death counter. You may reset your death counter to 0 using experience points in a shrine. But alternatively, you may also reduce your death counter by defeating enemies in certain areas or situations, as well as defeating bosses. It is important to remember that your age carries over to succeeding stages. However, if you choose to replay a previous stage and manage to finish it at a younger age, you will then start the next stage at that age. The age you start at is indicated in the stage selection screen, which is where you begin the protagonist's journey. Speaking of stage selection, let's talk about the next portion of this overview, the game world. Once you finish the prologue, you start the game in a place called Wuquan, a kung fu school where the protagonist resides. This place acts as your home base where you can practice combat, access the skill tree, inspect the detective board, or jump straight into the action through the stage selection screen. The detective board gives you some information about the stage as well as the boss you will be facing. But more than that, the detective board also keeps track of everything you interact with in the stage, such as enemies you encounter, locked locations, keys, and other collectibles that are spread out within the stage. Completing the detective board by exploring each stage carefully gives you more details about the story and its characters, since there are collectibles that are interconnected. Moving on to the stage selection screen, when you start a new game, you will have to finish a stage before unlocking the next one. From there, you will begin each stage at the youngest age you have unlocked them. In the case of the first stage, you always start at the age of 20 with your death counter at 0. Any stage after that will depend on how you perform on the stage directly before it. If, for example, you replayed a stage and completed it at a younger age, or worse, you completed it at an older age, then you will start the next stage at that age. In the event you've unlocked all the stages already, the starting age for a stage only changes if you finish the stage directly before it. Each stage is fairly linear, as you will have to clear the enemies in an area before you can proceed to the next one. You rinse and repeat until you reach the boss battle. Once you defeat the boss, the stage is finished and your age and death counter as well as skills and bonuses are carried over to the next stage. It is worth noting that not everyone you encounter will be hostile. In between battles, you may explore your environment to find collectibles and secret locked areas that won't be accessible to you on your first playthrough, but will be kept track by the detective board. As you go through each stage, you will eventually obtain keys that will allow you to open doors that lead to shortcuts, which you can take advantage of in future playthroughs. Shortcuts enable you to skip large chunks of a stage, which ensures that you only deal with fewer enemies before you reach the final boss. This is crucial as it significantly increases your chances of finishing a stage at a young age. Needless to say, completing each stage at the youngest age possible gives you a better opportunity to beat the game while also having a few deaths to spare just in case. Now that we've talked about the gameplay and the game world, let's talk a little bit about the story. SIFU is a story about a young martial artist who seeks revenge against the people who attacked his home and murdered his family. And while the unnamed protagonist is killed in that same attack, he is able to defy death because of a mysterious talisman in his possession. After 8 years of training to hone his skills in Kung Fu, he hunts down his family's murderers one by one. And while the game's story is driven by vengeance and violence, The story also touches upon the values of Kung Fu and martial morality, which is why there is more than one ending to the game's story. With that said, the game's story is as straightforward as it can get, as you will learn more about the murderers and their motivations when you progress through each stage.
I have spent 8 long years preparing for this.
By completing the detective board, you can also get a little more backstory about certain characters. Besides decisions that can lead to a different ending, the only player choice that has a very minor effect on the story itself is when you are asked to choose between playing a male or female protagonist in the prologue. As I've mentioned earlier, not everyone you encounter is hostile, and there are instances when you can choose whether to fight people or go past them peacefully. As for story length, there are only 5 stages in the game, but despite that, how fast you'll be able to beat the game depends entirely on how good you are at combat. Taking into account several replaying of stages as well as just going through the main story without completing the detective board, more or less you're probably looking at 10 to 15 hours of gameplay. For this segment of the overview, I figured I should mention some noteworthy features and options about the game. You may choose to hide visual effects clues and the heads-up display for a more immersive experience, but it may also increase the game's difficulty as you won't be able to see your health and structure as well as other visual cues such as certain enemy attacks. There is also no way to save manually for obvious reasons, as it prevents a player from just reloading an older save when a playthrough doesn't go so well. Of course, there are ways around this on the PC, but by default you won't be able to save scum. And last but not least, like most games these days, this game has a photo mode. For this section of the overview, I would like to do some pros and cons regarding the game. Now, as you can see with the title, this video isn't exactly a review, because what I wanted to do with this overview was provide an idea on what to expect from the game by showing you what it had to offer. With that said, maybe you're still undecided about this game, then hopefully this pros and cons segment can help you determine if this is the type of game that you would consider playing. So for my pros and cons, my criteria are relatively simple. Is it fun? Is it immersive? Is the story good? Are the graphics pleasant enough? Are the sounds done well? Is the game performance acceptable? How about replayability? So up first is fun factor. This game is very brutal and quite unforgiving at times, but it is pretty fun once you start getting a hang of it. The challenging fights and steep learning curve can get frustrating, but at the same time it is also quite fulfilling once you start to understand how combat works and you begin to see the patterns in place. Despite the level of familiarity and predictability after replaying stages, I can appreciate how any fight can still be unpredictable because of how dynamic the combat is. Whether it's a difference in how you positioned yourself, or perhaps in the way you took down enemies, or maybe an enemy simply did something you didn't expect them to do. There is a great deal of satisfaction in learning from your mistakes, while figuring out which skills are the most effective for your fighting style, as well as coming up with the most efficient way to deal with enemies. However, in consideration of people who might be looking to relax at the end of their day through video games and are not looking forward to add more stress to their day, then I'll have to put steep learning curve in the con column. Not because it's a con for me, but some people may not exactly have the time or patience to keep replaying over and over until they get it right. Furthermore, with no difficulty modes to choose from, this may also be a problem for people with disabilities. Moving on to immersion. If you have ever watched a Jackie Chan film where he uses the objects in his environment to his advantage, this game is essentially that. I've never thrown so many glass bottles in a game just to gain an upper hand. It gets quite daunting when you start getting surrounded by enemy combatants, but life gets a bit easier when you can kick a chair to knock down some enemies, while you grab the nearest object and smash it into people's faces just to hold them back as you deal with weaker enemies first. Other than objects you can throw, the walls, ledges, and windows are your friends, which make the environment another weapon on top of your evolving skill set. The game even uses the environment to determine the sequence used in your finishers, which is really cool. So overall, it has definitely been an immersive experience when you're placed in a position to literally fight for your life and win by any means necessary. Now, is the story good? I will have to keep this right in the middle. The story isn't bad at all, but it isn't exactly something you have never seen before as well. Putting aside the death-defying magic talisman that your character has, it is very much your typical revenge story where the protagonist suffers a loss and vows revenge and then succeeds. But as I've mentioned earlier, there is more than one ending, so without spoiling anything, the story does say something about being consumed by vengeance and that there are ways to achieve a goal even when there doesn't seem to be any other way. There are lessons to be learned about the values of Kung Fu and such, but in my opinion you're not going to be replaying this game for the story but because of its high-octane action and the challenge that comes along with it. Are the graphics pleasant enough? Combat animation is simply superb, and while this game obviously wasn't going for photorealistic graphics when it comes to character design, for what the game was trying to achieve, the relatively simple art style lends itself to how smooth the game is played. But besides character design, I think that each stage and its environments were well crafted and quite distinct from one another. Even the home base, which opens up more rooms as you progress through the game, feels lived in. So despite the game world being fairly linear, each location actually felt unique. Overall, their approach to art design was pretty solid, and the graphics were aesthetically pleasing for what the game was going for. Next up are the sounds done well. The sound effects that you would come to expect in a martial arts movie is very much reflected in every combat situation, and I have to say it is quite satisfying to hear the sound effect that indicates you've defeated an enemy, most especially when it happens consecutively. I also think the audio cues were done well as they are vital when it comes to opportunities to finish an enemy or when enemies are launching a devastating attack. Voice acting was alright, though for some reason, the protagonist's dialogue can sometimes be quite soft as if he were whispering to himself. But it isn't that big of a deal though since your character doesn't say much to begin with. When it comes to music, I guess it's sort of a given that the soundtracks would be heavily Asian-centric given the theme and the setting, but fusing the music with a more upbeat approach with some of the levels that warranted it was a welcome mix. When it comes to performance, I only got to play this on the PC, so that's the only platform I can comment on. With an i7-8700 and a 1080 Ti, the game ran smoothly from start to finish at the highest settings at 1440p resolution and 60 frames per second. As for how polished the game is, I didn't experience any crashes nor did I encounter any game-breaking bugs. Now how about replayability? If you've made it this far in the video, I don't think I even have to elaborate on this one. This game not only encourages you to replay it, but almost demands it. And it's not only just for a different ending, but you can always do better than your previous runs. I see myself jumping back into this game repeatedly until I can master each stage and beat the game at an age that I'm satisfied with. And also, I can easily see speedrunners constantly trying to outdo themselves with this game in the foreseeable future. But even if you're not a speedrunner or even interested in rushing through this game, your age in this game is basically the equivalent of your high score. Will you be able to top it, or is this the best that you can do? There's only really one way to find out. Alright, so that is it for this game overview. If this video was informative or helped you in any kind of way, maybe leave a thumbs up, consider subscribing and hit that bell icon as well so that you get notified whenever I post new videos. I will do my best to cover at least one new game per month in order to stay true to the channel's name of wandering through the world of video games. Whether it's a big AAA title or a relatively smaller game, or to be honest just any game that I find interesting, I will be creating another game overview of it. So once again, if you'd like to, like, subscribe, share, leave a comment, you know the drill. It will help the channel a lot, and as always, thank you all for watching and I will see you all in the next one.